Well, we had a great time at the book the other night, and so we started talking about what books we'll do next year in February and March, in case you want to get a jump on things. And for February, we're going to read My Name is Malala, which is quite a book, and I encourage all of you to join us for that. And the other book, we try to pick shorter things, but at least one familiar one, and it's going to be Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's The Hound of the Baskervilles. So that'll be another one we'll be discussing. If you've never read it, encourage you to pick it up. Now, just to remind myself, the other day, I found my audio version of it, and I've been listening to it in the car. The Hound of the Baskervilles is a Sherlock Holmes story. It was one that he didn't intend to write. Sherlock Holmes had successfully killed off his hero a few years before when he got sick of him. But then he just saw a landscape that was so striking, he had to write a story to go with it. And besides, it was a good source of money. So it was serialized in several magazines in Britain and in America, and then published as a book and been in print ever since. But one of the things that struck me, and this won't involve any spoiling of the plot, one of the things that struck me in listening again to The Hound of the Baskervilles is how quick the mail was. We think of ourselves as living in an instantaneous age, but what use is it when we send emails and texts at the speed of light if people don't bother to look at them? But in those days, they got mail at least twice a day. And you could write a letter in London in the morning and have it delivered all over the same day. And of course, if that wasn't quite fast enough, there were telegrams, which did move at the speed of light. Telegrams and letters meant that people were in constant contact. And even though there was no telephone, they could speak pretty quickly on various issues. And they could do it reliably. I was astounded to remember, in some ways, how much faster things moved at the end of the 19th century than they do now in the early years of the 21st. Now, this whole idea of trusty and reliable and swift mail brought me back to this letter of Paul to the Colossians. Paul is in prison for his faith in Rome. And yet he can write this letter to Asia Minor, to Turkey, the modern day Turkey, 1,200 miles away, and count upon the fact that it will be delivered on safe and trustworthy roads across those miles. Now, his messenger is himself a story, because it is thought that this letter to the Colossians was delivered with another letter, 2 letters for the price of one. The letter to Philemon, who has been agonizing over an escaped slave named Onesimus. And it is believed that Onesimus carried both letters from Paul in prison back to Colossae, where Paul, who could not command Philemon to release a slave that Philemon had every right to torture or kill, and no law could stop him. But instead, he's calling upon Philemon to remember that this is no longer a slave, but a brother in Jesus Christ. And the relationship to Jesus Christ changes everything, especially because, as is pointed out in this letter to Colossae, Jesus is not just a philosopher. Jesus is not just a teacher. He doesn't just give us handy words that we can put on a sampler and frame and display on the wall, never looking at them again. In this letter, Paul makes it clear in words that to me remind me of the first chapter of John. that Jesus is cosmically significant, that he is there from the beginning, that the mind of God in the long ages before creation is called forth is also the mind of Jesus Christ. And that if we want to know what God is like, we can do no better than to look at Jesus. Paul calls upon us at the beginning of this to give thanks with joy. Now, those are especially important words because thanksgiving for many will be anything but joy as we allow ourselves to be weighed down with the impossible task of trying to serve everything hot on the Thanksgiving table because those mashed potatoes cannot be made until the last second. And they have to be whipped up while the turkey is cooling and while the green beans are cooling and while everything else, and while all the other people are being helpful by crowding into a kitchen that is too small and making unspoken demands. And even if they make no unspoken demands, we imagine that these demands are being made. So giving thanks to God in this most important and actually most American of holidays, because it's not called for in the Bible specifically, is so often performed without joy. And here Paul in prison says that with joy we give thanks to the Father who makes us fit through our share in this holy light. He calls for us to display endurance and patience. And if we need anything during this holiday season, it is endurance and patience with ourselves and with each other. So even before beginning upon what is sometimes called the Christ hymn here, to tell us who Jesus is, Paul is reminding us to get back to the important things. But then he starts to talk about who Jesus is. And even there, Paul tries to show off his cleverness. There is a word that begins our Bible. It's sometimes translated in the beginning, or it could be at the head, at the start, in the foundation, when God begins to create. The Hebrew word. And that word he begins to play with because, like many words, it has meanings. And so he says Jesus is there from the beginning, which is that word in the start. He is the sum total of all creation is contained in him. That's contained in that word at the very beginning, Bereshit. He is the head, and the word also means head. He is the first fruits through the cross, being the first one to die and be raised from the dead. There is that word again. And that he is the ultimate ruler. As Paul begins to list powers and principalities and kings and all these other pretenders to the throne of heaven. Playing games with this word, maybe just because he could, but to show us that God's power is contained in Jesus, that if you've read Genesis, if you've read John, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and all things were created through him, and not one thing that was created was made without him. That you are seeing Jesus in action. That in our rising and in the setting of the sun, in every breath we take, in every thought we think, Jesus is there. The firstborn, the first one from the dead, the only begotten. Now, the reason I think Paul makes such a big deal in this beautiful poem about Jesus as the source of all things is because though we proclaim, especially on this Sunday, that Christ is King, it doesn't always look that way in the world. Our Nigerian brothers and sisters are faced with Boko Haram that loud, arrogant, discordant voice that somehow declares that they are the rulers of a nation when they shall pass like all other tyrants. In other places around the globe, there are pretenders to the throne of Christ who are arrogant, who speak, like it says in Revelation, in describing Antichrist, in a foul and horrifying way. And yet the one true ruler is Jesus. As Jenny shared during the offering message, rulers imagine they can shout, "Off with heads," and it will be done. And yet, as C.S. Lewis showed us in his gentle novel, The Horse and His Boy, the slave boy who becomes a king is told that a true king puts him or herself in the position of greatest danger and leads the charge, is last in every retreat, and is the one who tightens their belt even more and goes without during times of famine more than their subjects. We saw this in action, that Jesus took on the form of a slave, like it says in Philippians, and bent his knee to wash the feet of his disciples, taking on the odious task of a slave before the time of his crucifixion, being obedient even unto a cross. That is the model for us. If we would reign with Christ, we must serve with Jesus. We must be ready to wash the feet of others, to change the diapers of babies and adults, to boldly take up the cross that is given us, and each one of us bears a different cross. And in the marketplace, where all can see, make it clear that we are not ashamed of our brokenness, but that we see this as one more way in which we can display that the strength within us comes not from ourselves, but from Jesus. Why do we need Christ the King Sunday? To remind us just how glorious is the reign of Christ before we change our direction and see the ruler of the universe born as an infant in humble surroundings to grow up and become the one who laments that the Son of Man has no place to lay his head, to willingly walk the path to the cross, because that is the way, as Paul points out, to eternal glory. If this was easy, we wouldn't need the reminder. It's not always easy to serve people who make it as hard as possible for us to reach out to them. It's not always easy to serve those who reject what we have come to do. And yet it is worth being persistent. I began by pointing out how at one time communication was instantaneous, or at least it seemed that way in the bright new age of the late 19th century, when people believed that progress would continue unabated. They didn't see just ahead the horrors of 2 world wars with tens of millions being killed and nations laid waste. We're on the other side of those conflicts and involved in many more. And now we have no choice but to embrace the way of the cross as the only hope we have, to look to the landmark of the cross as the only light we have in the darkness, and to recognize that Jesus is the first, the head, the creator, the sum total of all that is, and the one who reigns not only from the cross, but beyond the empty tomb, in glory, who calls for us to give thanks with joy that this path exists through our suffering and beyond our suffering to hope and life and light. Amen.